Thank you very much for taking the time today to view our video. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to introduce ourselves. There are many aspects to 9.Connects, but it boils down to the fact that we're a PCB-centric organization. We believe and focus on the PCB due to the fact that it is truly the center point of all electronic design. That's where our expertise lies. We provide services not only in the PCB layout, but in design consulting as well. And during the technical portion of this webinar, you will see this expertise in motion. We are now the exclusive North American instructors for Altium Designer. We host 100 trainings throughout the year across North America, and we are excited to bring these trainings closer to you. In addition to our services, we are also a value-added reseller for a number of PCB-related software companies. And just to note, each company has been presented in past webinars. So if you're interested in them, please contact us or check out our website. And by the way, we provide one-on-one coaching for these tools as well. For more information on our services and past webinars, please contact us. Our information is listed in the description below. Thank you for giving us a moment of your time, and please enjoy the presentation.
So let me get on with it because I'm going to be basically feeding you from a fire hose. There's a lot here about the query language, but hopefully whether you're brand new at it or you're someone who's done it for a long time, you'll pick up one or two little nuggets that'll be make it worth your time to listen in on this. I'm going to try to keep it to 40 minutes or less, and of course if there's questions we'll try to answer a couple of those as well. So at this point you should be able to see my screen. I've got up a board here. It's got quite a few different violations on it. I'm also going to make a brief assumption that you've probably played with the design rule checker at some point. You may not be totally familiar with it. You may not feel comfortable with it, but you've at least seen it and know how it works in Altium Designer. And as I'm going along, you'll get to kind of refresh yourself with it if you haven't. Now, let me start off by saying this. Query language. I think all of us kind of shudder when we hear the word language because the first thing we think of is, oh man, I got to learn another language. And I want to kind of dispel that myth. And I'm going to do that two ways, some of the things I'm going to demonstrate. But the other thing I'm also going to do is I want you guys to think for a moment about all the languages you've ever played with from the time that you ever got interested in engineering, or if you're a technician ever since you got into the whole idea of electrical product. All right? Because at some point or another, whether you've done BASIC or Fortran, C, C++, scripting, even machine language, the fact of the matter is, in every single one of those languages, there's a conditional statement. And that conditional statement always starts with the word if. Okay? And that's exactly what we're dealing with here. We are dealing with nothing more than conditional statements. And because the only thing we're dealing with is conditional statements, we don't even have to put the if in front of it. We don't even have to worry about the then. Basically, we're going to say, hey, Altium, if this is true, do something with it. And there's really two different things we can do with it. We can select it. Actually, the key thing is to select it. But after we've selected it, we can either create a rule from it, or we can do a global edit from it. And I won't have time to go into global editing today, but I just wanted you guys to keep that in mind. So at this point, you should be able to see my board. And if not, just Christopher, if you hear anything from the chat lines, have them just chime in and let me know if there's any technical difficulties. But at this point, you should be able to see my board. This board's got a bunch of different errors on it. So if you see the line green, that's Altium's traditional way of saying, hey, we've got some errors here, okay? And I'm going to page up on one area in particular, and this is U2. Now, U2 is a little bit blocked over here, so I'm going to just do a very quick maintenance thing here. I'm just going to turn off the bottom overlay so we can see it a little bit easier. Now, you'll notice in Altium Designer that when I page down, I'd use page up and page down, by the way, for zooming. There's a ton of different ways for doing it through mouse scrolls and through commands in the menu. I just like to use the page up and page down keys. So when I'm referring to that, that's my way of zooming in and out, just to give you guys a little side note there. So if you basically page up, you'll see that there's little markers over here. And Altium did this so that you could see what layer this is on. In the past, when Altium used to do DRC checks, if it was a failure, it would always be line green. It was really hard to see where it was. And then they said later on, well, let's make it so that if you zoom in, you can still see the layer, but you'll have markers here to indicate that there is an error. Okay. And by the way, if you want to play and modify this to your own liking, you certainly can. They provided a feature in the DXP preferences. So under DXP preferences over here, and if we go over to the PCB editor, under the DRC violations, you could change all this stuff to highlight as you see fit. Okay, so just a little side note there that you can play with. All right, so I got U2 over here. Why did I pick U2? Because U2 is a problem that I think all of us have kind of come across at one point or another in our design work. Okay, so what's the issue? Well, let's say the manufacturer comes to us and says, you know, if you want to get this board at this price, you got to have certain clearances. Okay, and let's say, for instance, that the customer says, look, the minimum I'm going to allow you to have is a 9 mil clearance for our particular process. And you think to yourself, that's fine, I can work with that. And then you say, well, I'm going to create a general overall rule that says I'm going to have, for everything, maybe with the other exceptions, something different, but my general basic rule is, say, 10 mil gap. Okay? And then you put in a footprint, and sure enough, this footprint is not 10 mils. There's no 10 mil gap between this. Now, what I can do over here, just to kind of understand this a little bit better, is that anytime I do get a violation, I can right-click over here, and you'll notice third from the bottom it shows the violation, and it tells me specifically what it is. And if I click on it, it gives me a little more detail, and it's telling me, hey, look, you got a 9 mil clearance over here, and the rule that you've got, and I can tell that this is a overall rule because it's between two primitives, or any type of primitive out there, is the gap of 10 mils. Okay, and so now I've got a little bit of a problem. I could always change my entire rule that says, look, everything across the board could be 9 mils, but now I'm kind of pushing the manufacturing tolerances here, and my manufacturer might come back and say, you know what, this is going to be harder to make, or we're going to have to charge you more because you're asking for a process that requires us to do X, Y, and Z. So in general, I want to keep my rule at 10, but I would like to leave my footprint at 9, and I want to use this footprint at 9, and the manufacturer can tolerate some of that. So what can I do? Well, I don't want to change the footprint because obviously the manufacturer of the component knew what they were doing, and I don't want to question that, and I don't want to change things out. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, you know what, I want to keep a general rule of 10 mils across my entire board. I want to leave my footprint alone. I can create a special rule that says, look, I'll make this one 9 mils instead of 10 mils, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate. Okay? So what I'm going to do this is, rather than just jump straight into the query language, I'm going to show you a really cool feature that Altium has to help you along, especially if you're not familiar with the query language. Okay? I'm just going to push this over here a little bit. So what Altium can do for you is they have a really cool tool called Find Similar Objects. And I'm going to demonstrate it right now. And think of that word, find similar objects, or that term. What do they mean by that? Well, I want to find objects that are similar to something I've selected. Now, I'm dealing with the pads over here, and I want a rule that basically allows these pads some slack, right? I want them to have 9 mils rather than 10 mils. So what I need to do is select a representation of one of these pads. And that means I could select any one of these pads over here to help me get going. And in fact, I'm going to select this pad over here because it's not even violating, all right? So I'm going to right-click here. And Find Similar Objects is always towards the top, if not on the top, when you right-click after selecting an object. And this is true in all 4 editors, PCB, Schematic, Schematic Library, and PCB Library. If you click on something there, some type of primitive, you right-click, you will get the Find Similar Objects, all right? Now, I'm going to click on this here, and it's going to bring up this dialog. And at first, this looks a little daunting, but you're going to see the power of it in just a moment as I explain things. The first column that you see over here are all the properties of a pad, okay? And it's not any properties of a trace or something else. In fact, if I cancel here for a moment and I select a trace, and I right-click and I do Find Similar Objects, completely different set of properties. In Altium Designer, you cannot remove properties, you cannot create properties, and you cannot manipulate a property to do something other than what it was designed for. Okay? Now you can give it different values, but this list is solid, it's constant, you cannot be changed. Okay? So when Altium, oops, I pressed OK, and that's the result we got, and that's fine. So let me clear this here and then zoom back in, page up. And then, because I told it basically select all the traces, not a problem. All right, so I'm going to click on one of these pads here, and again, I'm going to right-click and do Find Similar Objects. So now, since I selected a pad here, we've got all the properties. In the middle here, these are all the values of this one pad that I had selected. And lastly, over here are all those things that I wish to compare against, if I want to compare against them. And let me just quickly demonstrate. You kind of just saw it unintentionally a moment ago, but I'll do it right now. By default, Altium's going to say, look, you've selected a pad, so by default, I'm assuming you're going to want other pads. And in fact, if I press the Apply button, you're going to see a few things happen here all at once. All right. First and foremost, you see the zoom matching because I have this turned on, and it zoomed out because it selected all the pads because that's exactly what I told it to do. It said, hey, object kind equals the same, pressed apply, it found all the pads. Now notice that this box did not go away because I pressed the apply button. Secondly, you may have noticed over here in the PCB filter panel, we got object kind equals pad. Why is that? Because I turned on something over here called create expression. And if this is turned on, and usually by default it's not turned on your Altium, you have to turn it on for the first time, and then Altium will remember this. Once you turn this on, every time you make a change over here, it will be reflected here. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to draw you guys to, is that the find similar objects will basically write your query for you. So in this case here, it selected every pad. In my particular example, I only want the pad to view too. So if I go over here to the properties, you'll notice one of the properties is a component. And it says, look, one of the properties of the pad says it allows me to associate the pad to a component. In this case, it's associated to U2, and that's the one I want. And I'm going to press same here. And again, I'm going to press apply, and you'll see a few changes here. Again, it zooms in because I have the zoom matching turned on. And you'll notice again in the PCB filter, it added on the additional statement component equals U2. So each time I turn one of these things on, the query will build itself. And let me talk a couple of moments about some of these other things here. And one other thing I'll make mention of here, because sometimes people confuse this. This is not an editing tool. This is a searching tool. So yeah, you could go in here and make changes to some of these things and say same to them, but it's only a filter. It only finds those things that qualify for what you've set up. It's not an editing tool. Okay, so I just want to clarify that. It's a filter tool. Now, we've already seen a few examples here. Zoom matching, you've seen the example. It'll zoom in or out based on what got selected. You have the select matched. Okay, so in this case, it does actually select these. So if I want to do a global edit further on, I've already had these pads selected. If I didn't, it would just highlight them. Clear existing, we've seen examples of this, right? If I did that initially, when I did this, I did it found all the pads. When I applied this again, it cleared what it originally selected, and now it only selected those things based off the new criteria. Create expression, as I just mentioned a moment ago, when this is turned on, your PCB filter is going to update. The masking, now I'm a big fan of the way this is set up right now, but you have some other options. You have normal, which means don't mask things out. You have dim, which puts some things kind of in the shadows, and it kind of tries to highlight those things that are being selected. My favorite one is the mask because it just outright tells me what got selected and pushes everything else into the background. The last one is the run inspector. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time for this. If you turn this on, those things that get selected are brought into the inspector panel, and you can do global edits in the inspector panel. Okay, I just don't have time to go into that one right now, but it's a very powerful feature if you're trying to do a global edit. For example, if you wanted to change all these pads, like you want to make them longer, you could actually do it through the inspector panel. And you can use the find similar objects to first select them and then get them into the inspector. But that's all I'm going to make comment on at this point, again, because I've got a lot to cover in very little time. Now I'm going to press OK. The big difference is it's going to run this one more time, but now it's going to close out my dialog box. So I'm going to press OK. Now I'm going to hit the clear button over here. If you ever get into a situation where you're seeing things being filtered, that's because of the fact you've run the FSO, or in this case, maybe your filter panel here. There's other places where you've done something. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to bring these other things back from the background, you hit the clear button here at the bottom right, and it'll bring everything back. And by the way, just to kind of quickly mention here, these things that you see here with the exact same features I just basically talked about a moment ago, and the find similar objects as well. So that's it, so I don't have to reiterate it later on. You can see that the same features existed with the FSO. They're over here as well. Okay, let's talk about the query. So I've got a query over here. All right, and I want to use this query. So what can I do? Well, Altium gives me a couple of options. The first one's the traditional one where I can highlight it, which I've just done, do a Control-C to copy it. I can go into Design Rules, and I can go here. I'm going to make an electoral rule here, and I can right-click and say Add a new rule, add it in there, and paste it in. But Altium says you don't have to do that administrative stuff. I can take care of that for you, and that's because of a little button over here called Create Rule, and I'm going to click on that. So Altium says, okay, it looks like you want to create a rule. Tell me which rule you want. We want a clearance rule, right? And I press OK, boom, done. Already created it, already took the query, already put it in, okay? So since I'm over here, let's talk a little bit about this because there's some important features. First and foremost, this is a binary rule, okay? And that means that Altium's looking between the clearances between two different objects. Now, I could take this one, copy it, and put it over here, and make it a very strict rule that says, look, between any two pads of U2, I'll allow for 9 mils. In my case here, I'm going to allow for a little bit of sloppage, just in case there's a via or a track in the nearby area. I'm also willing to allow this rule to stand with it. So I'm going to not change this here, but just want to give you the feel that you can have this. You can make that rule as tight or as loose as you want, but I'm going to leave this the way it is, and I'm also going to make the clearance here 9 mils. Okay. Now, I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment because it's really important, and this happens quite often to people, especially if you're new to the tools. If you have a mistake, you got to deal with it. Okay, so I'm going to throw a letter A in here, and then one of the things I'd recommend that before you press OK is you press Apply. And it's the same thing as the Find Similar Objects. It doesn't remove this, but it checks it to make sure that the rule is valid. And you can see that it doesn't like that. So what does it do? It makes this red, and it gives you a warning. Okay. Now, with this being said, I'm going to say no, all right, and I'm going to continue along over here. So let's just say I'm in a rush and say, you know what, this rule is good enough for now, and I'm going to move on. Now I'm going to press OK, all right, and then you're going to see that it says, hey, it's going to forewarn you one more time. You want to fix it now? I want to get on with it. Now this is what happens quite often when someone doesn't want to fix a rule that's broken. Let's say I go in here and I decide I'm going to move this thing now. Now I'm going to get this really odd little error that says the following: expected line 2, character 38. What this really ought to say is you got a broken rule, go fix it now. That's really what it ought to say, but Altium has not changed that. But if you ever get something like this, this is an indication that a rule is broken. Now, sometimes this will happen because you broke the rule where you're doing something in there. Sometimes this may appear when you're doing an ECO from the schematic side to the PCB side. You may have created some rules on the schematic side, pushed it over, didn't realize there was an issue, and then when this comes up, all of a sudden when you're doing the ECO, and that means get into your rules and get something fixed, because this will keep popping up until I get it resolved. So I'm going to cancel here. I'm also going to right-click and cancel my move here, and I'm going to go resolve that. So it's just one thing I want you to mention to you, that that will happen if you have a rule that's not working correctly. Now, in my case, I know what the error is. So I can just delete this. I can press Apply, and that should remove the issue. Now, what if you can't fix it, you don't want to get to it right now? You have some other options. So let me click on the clearance over here and talk about a few other things. All right. You'll notice that, number one, that there's 10 different priorities. This actually has quite a few priorities for this project, including the one that we just created. Now, in fact, one of the things I should do here is I should rechange its name here. So I'll call this Clearance Pads U2. Okay. So it's one good thing to do, and sometimes I forget, and I will correct myself to do that. I want to fix those kind of things, because if I just saw clearance, 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 yeah, I could look at the scope, but it's better that I know what that was specifically trying to target than to try to figure out what the query was trying to do. Okay. So let me go back over here and say that if one of these rules give me a lot of problems and grief, I can simply disable it. I can just turn it off. Okay. So that's one thing I can do as well. So if that rule just isn't working, just say, Altium, I don't want to delete it. I just can't get to it right now, and I just don't want that rule to trip me up. So you can just disable it at that time. Now, I also want to talk about priorities. And hopefully I can do this without becoming a tongue twister over here. But what does Altium do about priorities? So you'll notice that there's priorities. The highest one is the first one is going to be evaluated all the way to the lowest. Now, what Altium will do for any given component is that when it gets over here, it's going to start looking at each one of your queries. And the first one of those that it finds that adhere to that particular object that it's reviewing, that's the one it's going to test again, and it's going to ignore all the rest. So, for example, here's one that's for the RXO clearances. Let's say I've got a net, and Altium's going through and says, oh, it's not this one, or this one, this one. Aha, your net belongs to this net class. I will evaluate against this one, and then it will move on. It will ignore rules 7 through 10. Okay? So that's why the priorities are really important. And most importantly is this thing called the general clearance. And there's two things to note. Number one, this has got to be the lowest priority, because if it was priority 1, none of these would see the light of day, because everything would qualify for this. So then you ask, well, why do you have it in there? Because this is your safety net. You should always have what I'll call the general or the all rule, because these things will only find very specific instances. This will capture everything else. And if you've ever done a polygon pour and you forgot to have a general clearance in here, you'll see some really weird shapes happen because Altium doesn't know what to do. So you always want to cover all cases. You know, if you ever did like a case statement in a computer program, you always have this one called other or the rest. And it basically says, look, if it doesn't fall into these cases, then this is the one that you need to default to, and that's exactly what you're seeing over here. So this would never be higher than it's always the lowest priority, and you always want this one to be the most generic as possible, and you always want to leave it in there. And, excuse me, I'm getting over a little cold here. I'll get back to this over here, because one other thing I'm going to mention to you is that when I start seeing more rules here, like let's say you're starting to get to about 5 or more rules, this can start becoming a tangled web. And it has to do with these things called classes, which I'll talk about in a minute. The problem with I find with classes is a benefit, and it can be a curse, is that classes are buckets. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but just to give you some food for thought. Classes are buckets. And basically, you can put anything into those buckets. You can have a net class bucket and throw a bunch of nets in it. But each one of those nets themselves are not mutually exclusive, which means that you can have the same net in more than one net class. Okay? And that gets sticky, because if you call one net class here and another net class here, and they happen to have the same nets in them, and you start changing the priorities, well, you may have fixed something on one of them, broke something on another. Okay? And that's why you want to be a little bit careful when you set these things up and be methodical about it. One of the things we'll make a change over here in a few minutes is you'll notice that we have a number of rules that have the same clearance number in terms of 10 mils. To me, that's an opportunity for mistakes, and I'd like to consolidate that, and I'll show you guys how to do that in a few minutes. Okay? But for now, I'm happy with what we got. We made some changes here. I'll apply it. It's happy. We don't get any error messages. I'll press OK. And now Altium's going to reevaluate this, and if we did our rule right here, then this error should have disappeared, and it does. Okay? And the only reason why this is showing up here is because there is a violation on this, and this line is a part of that one there. So let me jump over here, and let's go over to the PCB filter and talk a little bit more about it. So we see that we've got this query, okay? And what you're also going to find about Altium is that Altium has more than one way to say the same thing, okay? And you're going to see that as I demonstrate a few tools that Altium provides for you. Find similar objects is a great way to start, and I'd say probably in about 75 to 80%, if not more, of the time, if you use the find similar object, it will be able to build the query that you are looking for. Now, what other features does Altium provide? They also provide something called the builder and the helper. Now, I get a kick out of this because I really think the helper should be the builder and the builder should be the helper. But bear with me, the helper came first, and then the builder came later, because the helper sometimes becomes overwhelming, and you'll see why in a moment. Well, let's go over to the builder here. And the builder is what I call the game of charades, because what the builder is asking is questions. So here's the first question, right? And it's saying, well, does it belong to this? Does it belong to that? Is it on this layer? Well, in our case over here, we know that it belongs to a certain component. So when we click on it, it goes through and says, okay, pick the component. And Altium has, and this is a term I use, it's called a type ahead, meaning if I start typing it, it will jump to that area. So I type in U2, and it jumps to that area in the list, okay, because it's a big list. Now I can click on this to do another condition, all right? And I'm going to say, well, again, I'm going to look around and say, what object kind is it? Well, in my case, it's a pad. So again, I'm going to start typing it in, and it jumps to it. Notice over here, look at the query preview here, something very different from the way this has been constructed, and yet it will do the exact same thing. Last thing I'll mention over here is Altium puts an AND in here, a logical AND by default. You can put an OR, and in some cases you'll need an OR. So make sure that when you're building this, that you pick the right logical union or junction here, okay, either an AND or an OR, okay? And you can keep on going further down. And you'll see this again a little bit later on as I continue to demonstrate. When I press OK, it overrules the last one I had here. I press apply, and it did the exact same thing. So some of these are, what you're going to find with Altium is there's really two types of conditional statements. There's either a Boolean statement like is pad, and it's either going to say, yes, if this is true, I'm going to select it. If it's not, I'm going to ignore it. And in some cases, it does need a little bit more. In some cases, it may even need an equation. And I'll show you that in just a moment. Now, let me get over to the helper. The helper is very powerful, but it's kind of like riding a motorbike when you don't know how to ride a motorcycle. So if you start with this one first, it's really tricky, right? Because you're trying to not only control a motorbike, but you're also trying to maintain your balance, and that could be kind of tough. So the other tool that provides you is how do you get onto the bike and how do you basically learn and feel comfortable on the bike. This is the motorbike now, okay? That's my analogy I'll give for this. So we've got some categories over here, and all these categories represent every single query that Altium has, okay? So if they got it, it's in here. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention here that's going to be probably of use to you, well, you'll notice over here first and foremost that they give a name and they give a description. What they don't do is they don't give you the construct for it. So a lot of times it's not easy to tell if it's just asking for a conditional like if this is larger than that, or if this equals 40, or if this is between this and this. Or sometimes it doesn't tell you if it's that or if it's just simply a Boolean. Now, sometimes you can get a hint from that based off of the membership checks, like has or in or is over here. Sometimes it will, that's kind of a tip-off. But one of the things I recommend to you, and please do contact your one of your sales guys if you want a copy of this, or you can dig on Altium's website. Sometimes they make it available. This is an old document, but it's still perfectly valid and still very much up to date. It's the Technical Reference Language Manual, TR, what they mean, Technical Reference 0110. It's basically a cure for insomnia, 349 pages, so it's definitely a good reference. However, it's very powerful, and it will show you the constructs of everything that you would ever want to see in here. And there's very, very few of these things that they've added since then. And you can always go to Altium, the live.altium.com, go to the tech docs, and you can type in the same thing, and it will also bring it up as well. So either way, you'll be able to get the construct of how that thing works. And that's what these are over here. Now, one of the ones I always like to demonstrate is one through the attribute checks, just to show you what an equation looks like. So I'm going to pick this one that says component pin count top. So it basically allows me, let me put that back in there and use it. So let's go back over here to component, and then I got to erase this because it's a very strict editor. If you tell it to add it, it will add it, but it won't move. It'll just put it where the cursor is. Component pin count top. What I know about this one, I can show it to you in the query language, is that this one's looking for an equation. So what if I'm asking for those components that have a pin count on the top layer of more than 10? And that's what I'm showing over here. And let's press OK. Now it's been added in, and if I press apply, it shows that. So again, that's why this query language is very useful, because it will tell you the difference between just a Boolean function and something that's going to require an expression. Okay. All right, what else do we got? Let me go back to the helper over here. So there's where all these are all of the queries that Altium understands. Okay. It's similar to, and again, pardon my cold over here. Similar to the properties, Altium does not allow you to add or create a query. It's got to be in there. Okay. Now, with that being said, let me go to the object list here. This object list here is based strictly on those things that you've already put into your design. If these nets exist in this design, the pads exist, if my polygons weren't shelved, they would exist, so on and so forth here. If you started a brand new design, you could click on this list, everything would be empty. Okay, so just to kind of give you an understanding. So again, if you get really good with this, you can go in here, pick something, then go over here and pick something again, and it will help you build that all along. The last one I'll mention to you are the system functions. So Altium provides actually some pretty powerful mathematics behind these. Okay, and I'm going to show you two examples. One of them actually has to do with signal integrity. It's an area that we are aggressively looking into, and we're hoping that in the next 2 months that will be one of our webinars to show the signal integrity tool. But they built this for the signal integrity, but you can also use this for your queries as well, and I'll show you a very specific example in just a moment. So all these functions are in there, and you can certainly use them. So you're asking, well, where would you use them? The most immediate thing, just to give you guys a little bit of a touch for this, is if I go into the Design Layer Stack Manager. So you have the impedance calculations over here, and again, these are used for the signal integrity. If you've invoked it, you'll notice that this over here is a part of the query language. Okay, so you don't have to learn a separate language to try to do this. Altium will use this query language to help you along with that. Now, I'll show you the other example in a moment as I'm flowing along here with my conversation. Let's talk about the history and the favorites. Basically the same thing, same dialogue, different tabs. So if I click on the history here, okay, it brings up all those things that I've recently done until they fall off the end. And if there's any that I like, I can always say add to favorites. And add to favorites is basically a capture over here, and it allows me to give it a different name, and it allows me to capture the expression. Okay. So for example, if I want to say is pad non-electrical, I just apply the expression and boom, I've got it over here. So I can use those over here if I have my filter panel up, but Altium gives us a shortcut as well, and that's the Y key. So if I hit the Y key, Y is in Yankee, if I hit the Y key over here, I'll show you a few things. First and foremost, you'll see all my favorites are here. Secondly, if I want to see the favorites I've got, you'll see the exact same dialogue that we just saw a moment ago here, and again, it brings up the history and the favorites. I'm going to close this. I'm going to hit the Y key again, and of course the history is over here as well, so I can even click on this one and bring up the same panel as well. So they give you a few ways to deal with both the histories and the favorites. Now, by the way, I'm just going to go off on a side note. In the last session that we did, someone asked, can these favorites be copied from one version to the next? And unfortunately, the answer is no. I have investigated that pretty thoroughly with Altium, and they don't have an easy way of doing it. So unfortunately, when you do these favorites here, you would have to basically recreate them if you move to a different version. I think that's something they'll need to fix, but just wanted to answer that question right off the bat. Let me go over here to examples, because these are examples that Altium provides by default and gives you some really good examples. And one of my favorite ones that they've got over here is this one called tracks less than 2 units long. So I'm going to click on it, and the reason I like this is for 2 reasons. Number one, again, you get to see the mathematics over here, okay? But number 2, what this does is this represents something that the rules cannot do. So this is trying to find those track pieces that are less than 2 mils, okay? And this is something that commonly happens, and it's not something that Altium can necessarily flag because, for example, this pad over here, if I double-click into it, well, this is a VCC, and it's touching a VCC pad. So from the DRC perspective, there's no clearance violation, there's no width violation. It's perfectly good to go. And then from an electrical point of view, this is fine. Where the issues may come in is when you generate a Gerber, this may actually become another Gerber piece, and that later on has to be cleared out by the manufacturer. Okay. So one of the shameless plugs I am going to put in over here, Jason mentioned it early on, we do have other product lines. And one of the things that one of the tools we provide is something called DFM Stream from Downstream Technologies that would go in and find these things and remove them to clean out your Gerbers. So if you're having some issues with your manufacturing guys or they're complaining quite a bit that Altium's leaving stuff in there that you don't want and the design rule checker is not really geared for that, we have a tool that can intercede for you on that. But nevertheless, there it is, and just something to keep in mind. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about classes. All right, and I mentioned them already, and I'm going to jump back into the design rules here. And as I mentioned earlier on, I think that there's too many rules here. And I'd like to consolidate this. And so one of the things I always mention to people when I used to do support and I saw a lot of rules and they're having a lot of issues is that if they have the same value here for this, and you can see all 4 of these have the same value, maybe they can be consolidated. Okay? And if I look at these rules, what they're saying is that in net class TX1, and we can look at what's in TX class net 1, but they're saying, look, if anything's in this class, we always want a distance of 10 mils. Well, same thing for RX1, same thing for RX0, same thing for TX0. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, all these classes could be mashed together and we could create one rule from that. And there's different ways to do that. So one way I could do that is I could create a brand new class with every single one of those nets that are in there and just say in this class, TX and RX. That's one way to do it. Another way is I could use the logical operators in this class or in this class or in this class and do the same thing down here. Okay. So the other way we're going to do it is a feature that they just recently added into Altium Design about 3 years ago. It's called the structure class, and that's the one I'm going to show. Okay. Excuse me. So let me go over here to design classes. As I mentioned earlier, classes are nothing more than a bucket. You can create these things all day long and never use them. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's different types of classes. There's net classes, there's component classes, layer classes, pad classes. They pretty much have classes for almost anything you need on all the major primitives, okay? So let's take a look at the net class. So you can see that there's a few of them over here. There's ones that they've created, right? In fact, here's the ones for RX and TX, right, which we just saw in the rules. And then they always have a default all net. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, I want to create a new one, so just to demonstrate it. So I'm going to say add class. All right, I got it over here. I'm going to right-click on it, or pardon me, double-click on it here, and then I'll right-click here and say I'm going to rename it. Let's say I want to do one for VCC, okay? And so I've got this one here for VCC, and then what it does is it shows me every single net that exists in the entire design. So I'm going to say, well, I want this one. If I want, I can press all of them, and they'll all go there. I just want this one over here. And if I scroll down, I can grab a few more, okay? So there are all my VCCs. I'm going to hold my Shift key down to grab those, and I'll push those over as well. I just created a net class. Don't have to use it, but I've got it there if I want to. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you got to be a little bit careful because these things aren't mutually exclusive. These could, in theory, show up in any one of these other rules. So just keep that in mind, that a net can find its way into multiple, actually not rules, classes. They can find their way into multiple classes, and it can get sticky when you try to start doing your prioritization. But just keep that in mind. Just want to let you know that this exists. The exact same process for all the other rules. And in fact, what we're going to create here is something called a structure class. And the way to understand structure class is really just rules of rules, or pardon me, classes of classes, pardon me. So I'm going to add a class over here because there's not one that exists. In fact, this project was designed before the concept of the structure class. And I'm going to add a new class. And what you see over here is it basically shows you all the classes that exist in all these other categories. So you can actually have a structure class that consists of a net class and a component class and a layer class if you wanted to. Now, in my case, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to right-click here. I'm going to rename this RX and TX. Okay. And since these already exist, I'm going to just take these 4 classes that already exist, and I'm going to make them a member. So I've now just created a class of a class called RX and TX. It took all 4 of these net classes and mushed them all together. Okay, and I'm going to press close. So it's now in there. So let's see how we can create a design or consolidate the design over here. If I go to design rules, I've got these here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and I'm going to delete 3 of them. Don't need 3 of them. Okay, so I'm going to delete this rule, delete this rule, delete this rule, and if I press apply, it will update. And it'll, hey, do you want to delete these? My answer is yes. So now let me go to this one, and I'm going to rename it. So I'm going to call this TX and RX. All right, and now my class over here, I need to use my structure class. So what I'm going to do here is, in this case, I'm going to hit my advanced query. And this is very similar to those things that you saw over here, in fact, if not the same. And in this case, I'm actually going to use the builder. I'll give you one more example. Because, again, I like my game of charades here. And one of the things it asked me for is, does it belong to a structure class? Guess what? I only have one structure class. So it made it very simple. So it clicked on this over here. I will do a Control-C to copy it. I'll put this over here, and I'll press apply. And now I've just created a structure class with basically those 4 rules are consolidated into one rule. Okay, and here it is. All right. Now the last thing I'm going to do, actually I'll press OK here. The last thing I'm going to talk about are what I'll call a regional rule. And there's other terms for it too. I call it a regional rule as well. This is a situation where you want a rule that's in a very specific location, but you don't want it for the rest of it. And this happens quite often, like with ball grid arrays, where you're allowing a lot more slop with the track width and the not only the track width, but the trace, the width and the clearance. Pardon me. It's the clearance and the width, and you want to have a little more slack there. So let me clear this for a moment and let me zoom out. So let me go view fit. Actually, I'm using VF. I'm using the VF key up here, so view fit, using the shortcut key. So I have a ball grid array in here, and let's say I want to have a rule that's very specific to this ball grid array. Okay, and we can do that, and that's what I'm going to show you guys here right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into the tools, and I'm going to go to auto route, and I'm going to say unroute all. Okay, and I'm going to confirm the lock primitives. So everything's just gotten torn out. So in order to create a rule for a specific location, we've got to use a room. And that's under design, rooms. Okay, and I'm going to use a polygonal rule because that allows me to shape this the way I so desire. And I'm just going to basically follow the path of the top silk. Okay, and once I've got that, believe it or not, the room is considered a property of the rules. It's kind of odd how Altium did that, but nevertheless, if I wanted to get into the properties of this, I got to go to the rules. So I'm going to go to Design, Rules, and I'm going to scroll down, and you're going to see over here this thing called Placement. And because I created a room, it now created this over here. I did not have any other rooms in here. It created this room after I added that polygonal shape over here. So I'm going to call this BGA Width. And I'm going to do a Control-C to copy, because I'm going to use it in just a moment. And I am going to apply it. Now I've got to add this to 2 different rules. I've got to have my width, and I've got to have my clearance. So I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to say a new rule. All right, so this is another way of doing it. I could do it over here. I could do it over in the PCB filter as well, as I mentioned earlier on. But I'll do it over here just to demonstrate it. If I create a new rule here, it automatically gives it priority 1. I double-click in it, and I'm going to call this clearance underscore BGA width. Now this time I'm going to use the query helper, and I have to admit you're going to see kind of a little bit of you can see how kind of easy it is, because in this case, when you're dealing with rules, you're dealing with the word width as the prefix, and there's not a lot of things that you need to change with it. So if I start typing in width, you'll see it's within room, and that's what I want. And then sure enough, that's my only room, so I click on that, and it filled it out for me very quickly. So I'm going to press OK here, and I'm going to do a Control-C. again, I'm going to leave this to all because it's those things that are within the room. So against any other primitives on the outside, I'm going to allow for some slack there. And again, I'm going to exaggerate this, but I'm going to say 2 for the mills. Okay. And again, obviously you probably want to look at your manufacturer's recommendations for that, but I'm going to allow for a width of 2 mils. And the same thing over here at the width. I need to create a new rule. Okay. And with this, I'm going to say BGA width. And what I did was, because it's in my copy buffer, I can just do a Control-V and paste it. So I've got it now here as well. And then I'm going to change my minimum. Again, I'm going to call it, let's say, 3. My preferred maybe 5. I'll leave the max at 10 here, and I'll apply this. And now I'll press OK. All right. And now to demonstrate this, so if I go into my interactive routing and hit the PT on my keyboard, that puts me into the place interactive mode. Again, I could do that from the menus. And when I click over here, you'll see that it immediately, because it saw that the rule, it saw the BGA rule for the room, it's allowing me to use what I created here. And what happens here is that once I get outside here, it now adheres to the rule that is outside the room. Okay? So this is a really great way of being able to go through here, and then once you get past that, you can, past the ball grid array, you can have it neck up to the trace that you prefer. Okay? Well, let's see, I think I've captured everything I can in the time that I've got over here. I guess we can open it now to any questions that we may have.